Imagine a cold, wind-swept cemetery on the outskirts of a bustling city, where the air bites at your skin and the sky hangs heavy with the threat of rain. The gravestones stand like silent sentinels, each one a story of loss etched in stone, and among them, a man kneels, his tailored suit soaked through, his hands trembling as they clutch a single white rose. This is Victor Langston, a billionaire whose name commands boardrooms and headlines, a man who has built an empire from nothing, yet now, in this moment, he looks utterly broken. His face, usually a mask of control, is contorted with a raw, unfiltered grief that makes the few mourners around him turn away, unable to bear the sight. The rose in his hand falls to the ground, crushed beneath his knee, as he stares at the freshly carved name on the tombstone, Eleanor Langston. His wife. His love. The woman he thought he'd buried his heart with. But this isn't just a scene of mourning. No, there's something far more devastating unfolding here, something that will unravel everything Victor thought he knew about his life. A small figure stands a few paces away, her tiny frame wrapped in a threadbare coat that's far too big for her, the sleeves dangling past her hands. She's no more than 10 years old, her dark hair tangled and damp from the drizzle that's begun to fall, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. This is Clara, a child who has no place at a billionaire's wife's funeral, a child who should be invisible to a man like Victor. But she isn't. Her presence is a jagged knife in his chest, because as she steps closer, her small, trembling voice cuts through the silence like a gunshot. "You're not my father," she says, her words sharp and cold, each syllable dripping with a bitterness that no child should know. Victor's head snaps up, his eyes locking onto hers, and in that moment, the world around him seems to stop. Her eyes, those piercing green eyes, are a mirror of Eleanor's, a haunting echo of the woman he loved more than life itself. But the hatred in Clara's gaze is something else entirely, something that chills him to his core. He reaches out instinctively, his hand shaking as if he could somehow bridge the chasm between them with a touch, but Clara steps back, her small body rigid with defiance. "Don't," she snaps, her voice cracking under the weight of her anger. "You left us. You left her. And now she's gone." The words hit Victor like a physical blow, each one a hammer against the fragile walls he's built around his heart. He doesn't understand, can't understand, how this child, this stranger, could know anything about him, about Eleanor, about the life he thought he'd lost. His mind races, grasping for answers, but all he can see is the accusation in Clara's eyes, the way her tiny fists clench at her sides, the way she looks at him as if he's the monster in her nightmares. The mourners around them whisper, their voices a low hum of confusion, but Victor doesn't hear them. He doesn't hear the priest's murmured prayers or the distant rumble of thunder. All he hears is Clara's voice, echoing in his skull, tearing open wounds he thought had long since scarred over. "Who are you?" he manages to choke out, his voice raw, barely above a whisper. But Clara doesn't answer. She turns her head, her gaze falling to the grave, to the mound of earth that covers the woman who meant everything to Victor. "She was my mother," Clara says, her voice so soft now that it's almost lost in the wind, but the weight of those words lands like a boulder on Victor's chest. His breath catches, his vision blurs, and for a moment, he thinks he might collapse right there, his knees sinking deeper into the muddy ground. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had a daughter. A daughter he never knew about. The thought is incomprehensible, a betrayal of everything he believed, everything he mourned. He had spent years grieving Eleanor, years believing she had died alone, that their love had been a fleeting, tragic chapter in his life. But now, this child, this furious, broken child, stands before him, claiming a truth that shatters his reality into 1,000 jagged pieces. Victor's hands claw at the earth, as if he could dig down to Eleanor, as if he could demand answers from the woman who had taken this secret to her grave. "That's impossible," he mutters, more to himself than to Clara, his voice trembling with a mix of denial and desperation. "She would have told me. She would have." His words trail off as Clara's eyes meet his again, and this time, there's no anger in them, only a deep, aching sadness that makes her look far older than her years. She tried, Clara says, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain that's now falling in earnest, soaking them both to the bone. She tried to tell you. But you didn't listen. You never listened. The accusation hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating, and Victor feels something inside him break, something he didn't even know he still had left to lose. He remembers the last time he saw Eleanor, 7 years ago, in a dimly lit cafe on the edge of the city. She had been pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had begged him to stay, her voice cracking with desperation, but Victor had been too consumed by his own ambition, too focused on the empire he was building to hear the fear in her words. He had walked away that day, telling himself he'd come back for her, that they'd have time to fix things. But then the news came, Eleanor was gone, killed in a car accident, her body burned beyond recognition. He had buried an empty coffin, mourned a love he thought he'd never feel again, and locked himself away in a world of wealth and power to escape the pain. But now, as Clara stands before him, her small frame shivering in the rain, he realizes that everything he thought he knew was a lie. Eleanor hadn't died that day. She had lived. She had lived, and she had borne a child, his child, and he had abandoned them both. The rain falls harder now, a relentless curtain that blurs the world around them, but Victor can't look away from Clara. He sees Eleanor in every line of her face, in the way her lips tremble, in the way her shoulders hunch against the cold. But he sees something else, too, himself. The shape of her jaw, the stubborn tilt of her chin, the fire in her eyes that mirrors his own. She's his daughter, he knows it in his bones, but the realization brings no joy, only a crushing weight of guilt. Clara, he whispers, her name a prayer on his lips, but she shakes her head, her small hands wiping at her tears with a ferocity that breaks his heart all over again. You don't get to say my name, she says, her voice rising with a fury that belies her age. You don't get to pretend you care now. You left us to die. You left her to die. Victor opens his mouth to protest, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words won't come. He's a man who has negotiated billion-dollar deals, who has faced down ruthless competitors without flinching, but in this moment, he's utterly powerless. Clara turns away from him, her small body moving with a purpose he doesn't understand, and as she walks toward the edge of the cemetery, he sees a woman waiting there, her face obscured by the shadow of an umbrella. The woman kneels, pulling Clara into her arms, and for a moment, Victor thinks he sees a flash of recognition in the way she moves, the way her hands cradle Clara's head. But before he can call out, before he can demand answers, they're gone, disappearing into the rain like ghosts, leaving Victor alone with his grief and the unbearable weight of a truth he can't yet comprehend. He kneels there for what feels like hours, the rain soaking through his clothes, the cold seeping into his bones, but he doesn't feel it. All he feels is the hollow ache in his chest, the realization that he has lost more than he ever knew, that the daughter he never knew he had hates him with a ferocity that matches his own self-loathing. And as the storm rages around him, Victor Langston, the billionaire who thought he had everything, realizes that he has nothing at all. But this isn't the end of the story, it's only the beginning. Because 7 years ago, something happened, something that set this tragedy in motion, something that Victor has buried deep in the recesses of his mind. And to understand why Clara hates him, why Eleanor kept her a secret, we have to go back to a time when Victor was a different man, a man who still believed in love, a man who hadn't yet learned the cost of his own ambition. 7 years ago, the city was a different place for Victor Langston, a man on the cusp of greatness but not yet the billionaire the world would come to know. Back then, he was just a driven entrepreneur, his name whispered in business circles but not yet plastered across headlines. His office was a modest space on the 15th floor of a nondescript building, the kind of place where the hum of fluorescent lights and the clatter of keyboards filled the air. Victor sat at his desk, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He was 32, ambitious to a fault, his eyes always fixed on the next deal, the next step up the ladder. But there was a softness to him then, a flicker of warmth that hadn't yet been snuffed out by the weight of his own success. And that warmth had a name, Eleanor. It was a rainy evening in late autumn, the kind of night where the city seemed to hold its breath, the streets slick with water and the air heavy with the scent of wet pavement. Victor had been working late, as he always did, poring over contracts and financial projections, when his phone buzzed with a message that made his heart skip a beat. "Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street. Please. I need to see you." It was from Eleanor, her words simple but laced with an urgency that Victor couldn't ignore. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his mind racing with the deadlines he still had to meet. But something in her message, something in the way she said please, pulled at him, a thread of guilt he couldn't quite shake. He grabbed his coat, the dark wool still damp from the morning's rain, and headed out into the night, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The cafe on 5th Street was a small, cozy place, its windows fogged with condensation, the warm glow of its lights a stark contrast to the gray world outside. Victor pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly, and there she was, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that she hadn't touched. Eleanor looked different that night, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that made Victor's chest tighten. She was 29, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands falling into her face, and she wore a simple blue dress that made her green eyes stand out even more. But there was something fragile about her, something that made Victor pause as he approached, his usual confidence faltering. "Eleanor," he said softly, sliding into the seat across from her, his coat dripping onto the floor. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the coffee cup, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the rim with her thumb. Victor watched her, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't explain, a sense of dread creeping into his bones. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers, and for a moment, she let him, her skin warm against his despite the chill of the night. But then she pulled away, her eyes meeting his at last, and the look in them was one of pure, unfiltered fear. "Victor," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing in the background. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating, and for a moment, Victor couldn't breathe. Pregnant. The word echoed in his mind, a thousand thoughts crashing into each other at once, joy, terror, disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "And I'm scared," she continued, her voice breaking. "I'm scared because I don't know if you want this. If you want us." Victor felt the world tilt beneath him, his carefully constructed plans unraveling in an instant. A child. Their child. He had always imagined a future with Eleanor, a life filled with laughter and love, but that future had always been abstract, something to be chased after he'd secured his empire, after he'd proven himself to the world. But now, here she was, telling him that future was already here, growing inside her, and he didn't know how to process it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, his hand reaching for hers again, but she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't," she said, her voice sharper now, though it trembled with emotion. "Don't say something you don't mean. I know you, Victor. I know how much your work means to you. I know you're not ready for this. But I need you to be. I need you to choose us." Her words cut deeper than he expected, each one a mirror reflecting his own fears back at him. He wanted to tell her he was ready, that he would choose her, choose their child, but the truth was, he wasn't sure. His mind flashed to the investors he was meeting with tomorrow, the deal that could make or break his company, the life he had spent years building. And in that moment, he made a choice, not with his heart, but with his head. "I need time," he said, his voice hollow, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. I need time to think." Eleanor's face crumpled, her tears spilling over now, and she pulled her hands back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield herself from the pain of his words. "Time," she repeated, her voice bitter, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "You always need time, Victor. But I don't have time. We don't have time." She stood then, her chair scraping against the floor, and Victor felt a surge of panic, his hand reaching out to stop her, but she was already moving, her steps quick and unsteady as she headed for the door. "Eleanor, wait," he called after her, his voice desperate now, but she didn't turn back. The bell jingled as she pushed the door open, the cold air rushing in, and then she was gone, swallowed by the rain and the night. Victor sat there, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of what he'd just done settling over him like a shroud. He told himself he'd go after her, that he'd call her tomorrow, that he'd make things right. But deep down, he knew he'd made a mistake that would haunt him for years to come. As he sat in that cafe, the rain pounding against the windows, Victor didn't know that this would be the last time he'd see Eleanor alive, or so he thought. He didn't know that the news of her death would come just weeks later, a car accident that left nothing but ashes and an empty coffin. He didn't know that she had survived, that she had given birth to their daughter, Clara, and that she had spent the next 7 years hiding from him, protecting their child from a man she believed had abandoned them. And he certainly didn't know that the little girl who would one day stand at Eleanor's grave, her eyes filled with hatred, was the daughter he never knew he had. But that night, as he watched the rain streak down the window, Victor felt a hollow ache in his chest, a premonition of the loss that was to come, a loss he wouldn't fully understand until 7 years later, when Clara's words would shatter his world all over again. 7 years ago, while Victor Langston sat in that cafe, grappling with the weight of Eleanor's revelation, another life was unfolding in the shadows of the city, a life far removed from the polished boardrooms and glittering ambitions that defined his world. On the other side of town, in a cramped, dimly lit apartment above a laundromat, Eleanor sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, her hands pressed against her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of the life growing inside her. The room was small, the walls stained with years of neglect, the air thick with the smell of detergent and dampness that seeped through the cracked window. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh yellow glow over the sparse furnishings, a rickety table, a chair with a broken leg, a pile of second-hand clothes folded neatly in the corner. This was Eleanor's new reality, a far cry from the life she had once dreamed of with Victor, a life she had hoped to build with the man she loved. She was alone now, the silence of the apartment broken only by the rhythmic thump of the washing machines downstairs and the occasional shout of a neighbor through the thin walls. Her hands trembled as she reached for a small, cracked mirror on the table, holding it up to her face as if she could find answers in her own reflection. Her green eyes stared back at her, red-rimmed and hollow, the weight of Victor's rejection etched into every line of her face. She had known he wasn't ready, had seen the hesitation in his eyes even before he spoke, but she had hoped, foolishly, desperately, that he would choose her, that he would choose their child. But he hadn't. He had chosen his empire, his ambition, his need for control, and in doing so, he had left her to face this terrifying new chapter alone. The mirror slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table, and Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Downstairs, the laundromat was a hive of activity, the kind of place where people came and went without looking too closely at one another. Eleanor had taken a job there, working the night shift, folding clothes and scrubbing stains for a few dollars an hour. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep a roof over her head, enough to buy the prenatal vitamins she needed, enough to keep her going until the baby came. She worked until her feet ached and her back screamed in protest, her hands raw from the harsh detergent, but she never complained. She couldn't afford to. Every penny she earned went into a small tin box she kept hidden under a loose floorboard, a meager savings for the child she was determined to protect, the child Victor had turned his back on. And every night, as she folded strangers' clothes, her mind drifted to him, to the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, the man who had promised her the world and then walked away when she needed him most. There was a photograph tucked into the corner of the mirror, a faded Polaroid of her and Victor from happier times. They were at a carnival, the lights of the Ferris wheel glowing behind them, their faces lit with laughter as they shared a stick of cotton candy. Victor's arm was around her, his smile wide and unguarded, and Eleanor's head rested on his shoulder, her eyes bright with a joy she hadn't felt in years. She reached for the photo now, her fingers brushing against the worn edges, and for a moment, she could almost hear his laugh, could almost feel the warmth of his touch. But the memory was a double-edged sword, slicing through her with a pain that was as fresh as the day he'd left her. She had kept the photo not because she wanted to remember him, but because she wanted her child to know who their father was, to know the man who had given them life, even if he had chosen not to be a part of it. "You'll know him one day," she whispered to the tiny life inside her, her voice soft but fierce. "You'll know he was a good man, even if he made a terrible mistake." The nights were the hardest, when the laundromat closed and Eleanor returned to her empty apartment, the silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. She would lie on the mattress, her hands cradling her growing belly, and talk to her unborn child, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. She told stories of the life she wanted for them, of a little house with a garden where they could play, of sunny days and warm nights, of a family that loved them unconditionally. But beneath her words was a quiet fear, a fear that she couldn't give her child the life they deserved, a fear that she wasn't enough. And in those moments, she would think of Victor, of the way he had looked at her in that cafe, his eyes filled with a conflict she couldn't reach. She had wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him see what he was throwing away, but she had known it was useless. He had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. One night, as she sat at the table, counting the coins in her tin box, there was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. She wasn't expecting anyone, no one knew she was here, not her friends, not her family, no one. She had cut ties with her old life when she left Victor, determined to start over, to protect her child from the chaos of his world. The knock came again, louder this time, and Eleanor stood, her hands shaking as she approached the door. She opened it just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway, and there stood Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman who owned the laundromat. Her face was lined with worry, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she held a small bundle in her arms, a blanket, worn but clean, embroidered with tiny blue flowers. "I thought you might need this," Mrs. Carter said, her voice gruff but kind, and Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat as she took the blanket, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion, and Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at Eleanor's swollen belly. "You're doing good, girl," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "You're stronger than you think." The words were a small comfort, a flicker of warmth in the cold reality of Eleanor's life, and as she closed the door, she clutched the blanket to her chest, her tears soaking into the fabric. She didn't know then that this blanket would become her daughter's most treasured possession, that Clara would cling to it through the years of hardship that followed, that it would be the only thing she had left of her mother when Eleanor was gone. And she didn't know that 7 years later, that same blanket would be draped over Clara's shoulders as she stood at Eleanor's grave, her small voice filled with a hatred that would break Victor's heart all over again. But that night, as Eleanor sat in her lonely apartment, the blanket in her arms, she allowed herself to hope, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she could give her child the life she deserved, even if it meant doing it alone. The rain had stopped by the time Victor Langston left the cemetery, but the chill of the day lingered in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He drove through the city in a daze, the sleek black car a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Clara's words echoed in his mind, a relentless loop that he couldn't escape. "You left us. You left her. And now she's gone." He didn't know where he was going, didn't care, but somehow, he found himself on the familiar streets of the old neighborhood, the place where he and Eleanor had once dreamed of a future together. The cafe on 5th Street was still there, its sign faded but unchanged, a relic of a time when life had seemed simpler, when love had felt like enough. He parked the car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the fogged windows, the warm light spilling out onto the wet pavement, and he felt a pull in his chest, a longing for something he could never have again. Inside, the cafe was just as he remembered it, the air thick with the scent of coffee and cinnamon, the soft jazz playing in the background like a memory come to life. Victor took a seat at the same corner table where he had last seen Eleanor, his hands trembling as he ordered a coffee he knew he wouldn't drink. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, set the cup down in front of him, and for a moment, Victor thought he saw a flicker of Eleanor in her, something in the way she tilted her head, the way her fingers brushed against the saucer. But then she was gone, disappearing into the bustle of the cafe, and Victor was alone again, his mind drifting back to the cemetery, to Clara, to the daughter he never knew he had. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, crumpled photograph he had found in his car on the drive over, a picture of him and Eleanor at that carnival, the one she had kept all those years. His thumb brushed over her face, and he felt a pang of guilt so sharp it stole his breath. Across town, in a small bakery on the edge of the city, Eleanor's daughter, Clara, was living a life Victor could scarcely imagine. The bakery was a modest place, its walls painted a cheerful yellow that did little to mask the wear and tear of years, the counter lined with trays of pastries that Clara helped bake each morning. She was 10 now, her dark hair tied back in a messy braid, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough beside the bakery's owner, a kind woman named Mrs. Harper who had taken Clara in after Eleanor's death. Mrs. Harper had been a friend of Eleanor's, a lifeline in the years of struggle, and when Eleanor passed, she had promised to care for Clara as her own. But Clara was a quiet child, her green eyes always searching, always waiting for something she couldn't name, and Mrs. Harper often caught her staring out the window, her small hands clutching the blue-flowered blanket that had been her mother's. That morning, as Clara rolled out dough for a batch of cinnamon rolls, she felt a strange restlessness, a pull she couldn't explain. She had been to her mother's grave the day before, had stood there in the rain and faced the man who had broken her mother's heart, the man she blamed for everything. But now, in the warmth of the bakery, with the smell of sugar and yeast filling the air, she felt a flicker of something else, something softer, something that scared her. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of paper she had kept hidden for years, a note her mother had written to her before she died. "My darling Clara," it read, "one day, you'll meet your father. He's a good man, even if he doesn't know it yet. Don't hate him for me." Clara traced the words with her finger, her throat tightening, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong to push Victor away, if maybe, just maybe, her mother had seen something in him that she couldn't. Mrs. Harper noticed the change in Clara, the way her hands stilled on the dough, the way her eyes grew distant. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle as she wiped her hands on her apron. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the note, and then she shook her head, her braid swinging against her back. "Nothing," she said, her voice small but firm, and Mrs. Harper didn't press her. But as Clara turned back to her work, her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the man in the cemetery, to the way his face had crumpled when she told him the truth. She didn't want to feel sorry for him, didn't want to care, but there was something in his eyes, something that reminded her of the stories her mother used to tell, stories of a man who had once loved her more than anything in the world. Back at the cafe, Victor's coffee had gone cold, but he didn't notice. He was lost in his own thoughts, his mind replaying every moment he had shared with Eleanor, every promise he had broken. He remembered the way she had looked at him that night, her eyes pleading for him to stay, and he remembered the way he had walked away, telling himself he'd come back for her. But he hadn't. He had buried himself in his work, in his ambition, and when the news of her death came, he had buried his heart with her, or so he thought. Now, as he sat in the cafe, the photograph in his hand, he felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that he could find Clara, that he could make things right, that he could be the father she deserved, even if she hated him for it. As he stood to leave, his eyes caught on a small detail in the photograph, a detail he hadn't noticed before. In the background, behind him and Eleanor, was a street sign, 5th Street, the same street he was on now. And there, on Eleanor's wrist, was a thin red bracelet, a simple thing made of braided thread, the kind of thing you'd buy at a carnival for $1. Victor's breath caught in his throat, because he remembered that bracelet, remembered tying it onto her wrist that night, a silly gesture that had made her laugh. And he remembered seeing that same bracelet yesterday, on Clara's wrist, as she stood at Eleanor's grave. The realization hit him like a wave, a connection he couldn't ignore, and as he stepped out into the street, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, he knew he had to find her. He didn't know where she was, didn't know if she'd ever forgive him, but he knew he couldn't stop looking, not now, not ever. And as he walked away from the cafe, the past and the present colliding in his mind, he didn't see Clara through the window of a passing bus, her small face pressed against the glass, her green eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and longing. The city buzzed with the hum of a new day, its streets alive with the rhythm of morning traffic and the chatter of pedestrians, but for Victor Langston, the world felt muted, as if he were moving through a dream. He had spent the night in his penthouse, the sprawling space that once felt like a testament to his success now a hollow shell, its silence mocking him as he paced the marble floors. Sleep had eluded him, Clara's words from the cemetery playing on a relentless loop in his mind, her small, furious voice cutting through the fog of his grief. He had to find her, had to make things right, but he didn't know where to start. The red bracelet from the photograph was his only clue, a fragile thread connecting him to the daughter he had never known, and he clung to it like a lifeline, a symbol of the love he had lost and the chance he might still have to redeem himself. That morning, Victor found himself at a charity gala, an event he had agreed to attend months ago, before his world had turned upside down. The ballroom of the Lancaster Hotel was a glittering spectacle, its chandeliers casting a warm glow over the crowd of well-dressed guests, their laughter and clinking glasses a stark contrast to the storm inside him. He stood near the bar, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, his tailored suit impeccable but his face drawn, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his features. He had no interest in the small talk, the networking, the superficial smiles, but he had come for a reason. The gala was raising funds for local orphanages, and Victor had a hunch, a desperate, irrational hope, that Clara might be connected to one of them, that he might find a trace of her here, among the stories of children who had lost everything. Across the room, Clara was there, though Victor didn't know it yet. She had come with Mrs. Harper, who had been invited to cater the event, her bakery providing the desserts for the evening. Clara stood behind a table near the back, her small hands carefully arranging trays of cinnamon rolls and lemon tarts, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon, her green eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. She didn't want to be here, didn't like the noise, the crowd, the way the wealthy guests looked through her as if she were invisible. But Mrs. Harper had insisted, saying it was good for the bakery, good for Clara to get out, to see the world beyond their little corner of the city. Clara had agreed, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the man at the cemetery, to the note her mother had left her, to the father she had pushed away. Victor's gaze swept the room, his heart heavy with a longing he couldn't name, and then he saw her, a small figure in a simple blue dress, standing behind a dessert table, her movements careful and deliberate. His breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening around the champagne glass, because even from across the room, he knew it was her. The way she tilted her head, the way her hands moved, the way her eyes seemed to hold a world of secrets, it was Eleanor, reborn in the form of this child, his child. He set the glass down, his movements slow, deliberate, as if any sudden motion might shatter the moment, and he began to walk toward her, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. Clara felt a shift in the air, a prickle at the back of her neck, and she looked up, her eyes meeting Victor's across the crowded room. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the noise of the gala fading into a distant hum, the space between them shrinking until it felt like they were the only two people in the world. She recognized him immediately, the man from the cemetery, the man who had looked at her with such raw, desperate grief, and her hands froze on the tray of tarts, her breath hitching in her chest. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the crowd, but her feet wouldn't move, her body rooted to the spot as he approached, his steps measured but purposeful. Victor stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his eyes locked on hers. Up close, he could see the details he had missed at the cemetery, the faint freckles across her nose, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her green eyes mirrored Eleanor's so perfectly it made his chest ache. "Clara," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd, but she heard him, and the sound of her name on his lips made her flinch, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm Victor," he continued, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. I need to talk to you." Clara's eyes narrowed, her body tensing, but she didn't speak, her silence a wall between them, a barrier he didn't know how to breach. Mrs. Harper, who had been arranging a tray of cookies nearby, noticed the exchange and stepped closer, her protective instincts kicking in. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, her eyes flicking between Victor and Clara. Victor tore his gaze from Clara, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound as desperate as he felt. "I'm Victor Langston," he said, his voice steadier now, though his hands were still trembling. I knew her mother. I just want to speak with her for a moment." Mrs. Harper hesitated, her gaze softening as she saw the raw emotion in his eyes, and she nodded, stepping back but keeping a watchful eye on them. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't untangle. She didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to hear his excuses, but there was something in his voice, something in the way he looked at her, that made her pause. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice small but sharp, her eyes never leaving his. Victor swallowed hard, his throat tight, and he took a step closer, his hand reaching out instinctively before he caught himself and let it fall. "I want to know you," he said, his voice breaking. "I want to make things right. I didn't know. I didn't know about you, Clara. I swear I didn't." Her eyes flashed with a mix of anger and pain, her small hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You didn't know because you didn't care," she said, her voice rising, though it trembled with the weight of her emotions. "You left her. You left us. And now you think you can just show up and fix everything?" Victor felt her words like a physical blow, each one a reminder of his failure, his shame, but he didn't look away, didn't flinch. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raw, his eyes pleading. "I was wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it if you'll let me. But I need you to give me a chance, Clara. Please." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 memories of her mother's stories, her mother's tears. And then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, her eyes caught on the red bracelet on her wrist, the one her mother had given her, the one Victor had tied on Eleanor's wrist all those years ago. She froze, her breath catching, because in that moment, she remembered her mother's words, "He's a good man, even if he doesn't know it yet." And as Victor followed her gaze, his own eyes landing on the bracelet, he felt a jolt of recognition, a memory so vivid it nearly brought him to his knees. "That bracelet," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with shock. "I gave that to your mother, the night we met at the carnival." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, she saw something in him that made her heart stutter, not anger, not hatred, but a longing so deep it mirrored her own. The gala continued around them, a swirl of laughter and clinking glasses, but for Victor Langston and Clara, the world had narrowed to the small space between them, a fragile bridge built on shared grief and unspoken questions. Clara's eyes were still locked on Victor's, her small hand instinctively touching the red bracelet on her wrist, the one that had once belonged to her mother, the one that now tied her to this man she wanted to hate but couldn't fully. Victor's words hung in the air, "I gave that to your mother, the night we met at the carnival," and they stirred something in Clara, a memory of her mother's stories, of a night filled with lights and laughter, a night that had shaped her life before she was even born. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but her throat was tight, her emotions a tangled knot she couldn't unravel. Victor, too, was caught in the grip of memory, the sight of the bracelet pulling him back to that carnival 7 years ago, to the moment he had tied it onto Eleanor's wrist, her laughter ringing in his ears as they shared cotton candy under the glow of the Ferris wheel. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his, the way her green eyes had sparkled with a joy he hadn't seen since. But now, standing before Clara, he saw that same sparkle in her eyes, a haunting echo of the woman he had loved and lost, and it made his chest ache with a longing he couldn't suppress. "Clara," he said again, his voice softer now, almost a plea, but before he could say more, Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her presence a gentle interruption in the charged moment. "Clara, we need to finish setting up the dessert table," Mrs. Harper said, her tone kind but firm, her eyes flicking to Victor with a mix of curiosity and caution. Clara blinked, as if waking from a trance, and nodded, her small hands smoothing her dress as she turned back to the trays of pastries. But Victor couldn't let her go, not yet, not when he was so close to understanding, to connecting. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent, and Mrs. Harper paused, her brow furrowing as she looked at him. "I'd like to hire your bakery for an event," he said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A private event, at my office. I'll need someone to oversee the catering. Clara, I'd like you to be there, to help with the arrangements." It was a flimsy excuse, a desperate attempt to keep her close, but he didn't care. He needed time, needed a chance to speak with her, to bridge the gap between them. Mrs. Harper hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the practical need for business, but the promise of a high-profile client was hard to ignore. "We'd be happy to cater your event, Mr. Langston," she said finally, her voice measured. "Clara can help with the preparations, but I'll be there to oversee everything." Victor nodded, his relief palpable, though his eyes never left Clara, who was watching him now with a guarded expression, her small face a mask of uncertainty. She didn't speak, didn't agree, but she didn't refuse either, and that was enough for Victor to hold on to as he stepped back, giving her space, though every instinct screamed at him to stay. The next day, Clara found herself in the gleaming lobby of Langston Enterprises, her small frame dwarfed by the towering glass walls and polished marble floors. She clutched a tray of sample pastries in her hands, her heart pounding as she followed Mrs. Harper to the elevator, the red bracelet on her wrist a constant reminder of the man she was about to face. The office was a world away from the bakery, a place of power and precision, and Clara felt out of place, her worn sneakers squeaking against the floor, her blue dress a stark contrast to the sleek suits of the employees around her. Mrs. Harper, sensing her unease, gave her a reassuring smile, but Clara's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts a jumble of fear and curiosity as the elevator doors opened to the executive floor. Victor was waiting for them in a conference room, the long table set with papers and a laptop, though his attention was clearly elsewhere. He stood as they entered, his suit impeccable but his face drawn, the sleepless nights evident in the shadows under his eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady but laced with an emotion he couldn't hide, his gaze settling on Clara with an intensity that made her look away. Mrs. Harper set down her own tray of pastries, launching into a discussion about the menu for the event, but Victor's focus was on Clara, on the way she stood slightly behind Mrs. Harper, her small hands gripping the tray, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Clara," he said, his voice cutting through the conversation, and she froze, her eyes meeting his reluctantly. "Would you mind helping me with something?" He gestured to a side table where a coffee machine sat, a flimsy excuse to get her alone, but Clara nodded, her movement stiff as she set down her tray and followed him. Mrs. Harper watched them go, her expression unreadable, but she didn't intervene, sensing that something deeper was at play. Victor led Clara to the table, his hands fumbling with the coffee machine as he tried to find the words, his heart racing with the weight of what he needed to say. "I know you don't trust me," he began, his voice low, his eyes on the machine as if it could anchor him. "And I don't blame you. But I want you to know that I loved your mother. More than anything. And I want to know you, Clara. I want to be there for you, if you'll let me." Clara didn't respond, her small hands clenched at her sides, her eyes fixed on the floor, but Victor could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched as he spoke. He turned to her then, his movements slow, careful, and for the first time, he noticed the way the light caught on the red bracelet, the way it seemed to glow against her pale skin. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, his gaze fell to her neck, where a small pendant hung on a thin chain, a pendant he recognized immediately. It was a tiny silver star, a gift he had given Eleanor on their first anniversary, a symbol of the dreams they had shared under the night sky. His breath caught, his hand reaching out instinctively, but he stopped himself, his fingers hovering in the air as Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition. "That pendant," Victor whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes locked on the star. "I gave that to your mother. She wore it every day." Clara's hand flew to the pendant, her fingers closing around it protectively, and for a moment, she looked like she might bolt, her small body tensing as if ready to run. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, her words a dagger in Victor's heart. "She gave it to me," she said, her eyes meeting his, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. "She said it was the only thing she had left of you. The only thing that reminded her of the man you used to be." Victor felt the words like a physical blow, his knees weakening, his mind reeling with the weight of what he had lost, what he had thrown away. And as Clara stood there, the pendant in her hand, the red bracelet on her wrist, he knew that this was his daughter, his flesh and blood, and that he would do anything, to make things right, even if it took the rest of his life. The conference room at Langston Enterprises felt colder now, the air heavy with the unspoken truths that hung between Victor Langston and Clara, the little girl who had turned his world upside down. Victor stood frozen, his eyes still fixed on the silver star pendant around Clara's neck, the one he had given Eleanor all those years ago, a symbol of a love he thought he'd buried. His mind raced, memories crashing into him like waves against a crumbling shore, the night he had given Eleanor that pendant, the way her eyes had lit up as she clasped it around her neck, the promises they had whispered under a sky full of stars. But those promises had turned to ash, and now, standing before him, was the living proof of his failure, a daughter who looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance, her small hand clutching the pendant as if it could shield her from the pain of his presence. Clara's words echoed in his mind, "She said it was the only thing she had left of you. The only thing that reminded her of the man you used to be." They cut deeper than he could have imagined, each syllable a reminder of the man he had been, the man he had lost in his relentless pursuit of power. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg for her forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come, his throat tight with a grief he couldn't name. Clara, too, seemed caught in her own storm, her green eyes searching his face for something she couldn't find, her small body tense as if she might flee at any moment. The silence between them was a chasm, wide and unbridgeable, and Victor felt the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to crush what little hope he had left. It was Mrs. Harper who broke the silence, her voice a gentle intrusion as she stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Langston, we should finalize the menu for the event," she said, her tone professional but laced with a quiet concern, her eyes flicking between Victor and Clara. Victor nodded, grateful for the distraction, though his gaze lingered on Clara for a moment longer before he turned away, his hands trembling as he reached for the papers on the table. But as he moved, something fell from his pocket, a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, that fluttered to the floor at Clara's feet. She bent to pick it up, her movements slow, cautious, and as she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening with a shock that mirrored Victor's own. The paper was a letter, written in Eleanor's familiar, looping handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Victor," it began, and Clara's hands shook as she read the words, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke them aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I never got the chance to tell you the truth. Our daughter, Clara, is the best thing I've ever done, and she's yours, Victor. I wanted to tell you that night at the cafe, but you weren't ready, and I couldn't bear to see you walk away again. I've raised her alone, but I've told her about you, about the man I loved, the man I believe you can still be. Don't let her grow up without knowing you. Don't let my death be the end of your story." The letter ended with a simple plea, "Find her, Victor. Love her for me." And a small, pressed flower, a forget-me-not, tucked into the fold of the paper. Victor's knees buckled, and he sank into the nearest chair, his hands covering his face as the weight of Eleanor's words crashed over him. She had written this letter knowing she might not survive, knowing that Victor might never know the truth unless she left it for him to find. And somehow, by some cruel twist of fate, the letter had stayed with him all these years, tucked into a pocket he rarely used, a silent reminder of the life he had abandoned. He remembered finding it among Eleanor's things after the news of her death, but he had been too consumed by grief to read it, too afraid of what it might say. He had kept it, a piece of her to hold on to, but he had never opened it, until now, when Clara's small hands had unfolded the truth he had been too cowardly to face. Clara stood there, the letter trembling in her hands, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at Victor, her small voice breaking the silence. "She wanted you to find me," she said, her words a mix of accusation and wonder, her green eyes searching his face for answers he didn't have. "She wanted you to love me. But you didn't. You didn't even try." Victor's head snapped up, his hands falling away from his face, his eyes red and raw as he met her gaze. "I didn't know," he said, his voice hoarse, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Clara, I swear I didn't know. I thought she was gone. I thought I'd lost her forever. If I had known about you, I would have." His voice broke, and he shook his head, his hands clenching into fists as he fought to keep himself together. "I would have been there. I would have fought for you." Clara's tears spilled over now, her small body shaking as she clutched the letter to her chest, the pressed flower falling to the floor at her feet. "But you didn't," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the hum of the air conditioning, but the pain in it was deafening. "You didn't fight for her. You didn't fight for me. And now she's gone, and I'm here, and I don't know how to forgive you." Victor felt her words like a knife in his chest, each one a reminder of his failure, his shame, and he stood, his movements unsteady, his hands reaching out as if he could somehow hold on to her, keep her from slipping away. "Clara, please," he said, his voice cracking, his eyes pleading. "I know I failed you. I failed your mother. But I'm here now. I'm here, and I'll do anything to make this right. Anything." Mrs. Harper, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease, stepped forward, her hand resting on Clara's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "Clara, let's take a break," she said, her eyes flicking to Victor with a warning he couldn't ignore. "We can finish this later." Clara nodded, her small hands folding the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket as if it were a piece of her mother she couldn't bear to let go. She turned to leave, her steps slow, her shoulders hunched, but Victor's voice stopped her, his words a desperate plea that echoed in the sterile room. "If you're really my daughter," he said, his voice trembling, his eyes locked on her retreating form, "then I've already lost more than I can bear. Don't let me lose you again." Clara paused, her hand on the door, her small body trembling with the weight of his words, and for a moment, Victor thought she might turn back, might give him the chance he so desperately needed. But then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Victor alone with the ghost of Eleanor's letter and the unbearable truth that he might never be able to fix what he had broken. The conference room at Langston Enterprises felt like a tomb after Clara left, the silence suffocating, the air thick with the weight of truths that had been buried for too long. Victor Langston stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the door Clara had disappeared through, his hands trembling at his sides as the echo of her words, "I don't know how to forgive you," cut through him like a blade. The letter, Eleanor's letter, lay on the floor where Clara had dropped the pressed forget-me-not, its faded petals a stark reminder of the life he had lost, the family he had never known. He sank to his knees, his tailored suit crumpling as he reached for the flower, his fingers brushing against it with a reverence that belied the storm inside him. He had thought he knew grief, thought he had felt its full weight when he believed Eleanor had died all those years ago, but this was something else entirely, a pain so raw, so visceral, that it threatened to tear him apart. Mrs. Harper lingered for a moment, her hand on the door, her eyes soft with a compassion that Victor didn't deserve. "Give her time, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice quiet but firm, her words a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. "She's been through more than any child should. She needs to process this in her own way." Victor nodded, though he barely heard her, his mind consumed by the image of Clara's tear-streaked face, the way her small hands had clutched Eleanor's letter as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world. Mrs. Harper left then, her footsteps fading down the hall, and Victor was alone, the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical force, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of the life he had unknowingly destroyed. He didn't know how long he sat there, the letter in his hands, Eleanor's words burning into his soul, but eventually, he forced himself to stand, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were afraid he might shatter with the slightest misstep. He needed to see Clara again, needed to hear the whole truth, needed to understand how he had failed so completely. He left the conference room, his steps unsteady, and made his way to the bakery where he knew Clara and Mrs. Harper had returned. The drive was a blur, the city passing by in a haze of gray, and when he arrived, the small yellow building looked like a beacon in the storm, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness inside him. Inside, the bakery was quiet, the afternoon lull leaving the space empty except for Clara, who sat at a small table in the corner, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. Mrs. Harper was in the back, her voice a soft hum as she worked, and Victor hesitated at the door, his heart pounding as he watched Clara, his daughter, the child he had never known he had. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly, and Clara's head snapped up, her green eyes meeting his with a mix of fear and resignation. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her body tensed, her small hands tightening around the mug as Victor approached, his steps slow, his hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes pleading as he stopped a few feet away. "I need to know the truth. All of it. Please." Clara's gaze flickered, her lips trembling as she looked at him, and for a moment, he thought she might turn away, might shut him out again. But then she spoke, her voice small but steady, her words a dagger in his heart. "Why do you care now?" she asked, her eyes searching his, her voice laced with a pain that made Victor's chest ache. "You didn't care then. You didn't care when she needed you. Why should I tell you anything?" Victor swallowed hard, his throat tight, his hands clenching at his sides as he fought to keep his composure. "Because I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was wrong, and I've spent 7 years believing a lie, thinking I'd lost her forever. But I didn't lose her then, Clara. I lost her because I walked away. And I lost you. I need to know what happened. I need to know so I can try to make this right." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her small body trembling as she set the mug down, her hands shaking as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She slid it across the table, her movements slow, deliberate, and Victor's breath caught as he picked it up, his hands trembling as he looked at the image. It was Eleanor, her face pale but radiant, her arms wrapped around a newborn Clara, her green eyes filled with a love so fierce it took Victor's breath away. "She didn't die in that car accident," Clara said, her voice steady now, though it trembled with emotion. "That was a lie. She faked her death because she knew you'd never let her go, not really. She wanted to protect me, to keep me away from your world, from the danger she thought it would bring. She raised me alone, in secret, until she got sick. And then she was gone, for real this time. And I was left with nothing but her stories about you, about the man she loved, the man she hoped you'd become." Victor's knees buckled, and he sank into the chair across from Clara, the photograph trembling in his hands as her words washed over him, each one a revelation, a wound, a truth he couldn't escape. Eleanor had faked her death. She had lived, had raised their daughter, had loved him even after he had abandoned her. And he had never known, had never suspected, had never thought to look beyond the news reports, the empty coffin, the grief that had consumed him. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raw, his eyes brimming with tears as he looked at her, his daughter, the child he had failed. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." But Clara wasn't finished, her small voice rising with a fury that belied her age, her hands clenching into fists as she leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a pain that mirrored his own. "You should have known," she said, her voice breaking, her tears spilling over now. "You should have fought for her. You should have fought for me. But you didn't. And now she's gone, and I'm here, and I don't know how to be your daughter." Victor felt the words like a physical blow, his hands clutching the photograph as if it could anchor him, his mind reeling with the weight of what he had done, what he had lost. And then Clara reached into her bag, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper, a drawing, crude but heartfelt, of a man in a suit holding hands with a little girl. "I drew this for you," she said, her voice barely audible, her eyes locked on his. "I used to dream you'd come find me. But you never did." Victor's tears fell then, hot and silent, as he looked at the drawing, at the hope it represented, the hope he had crushed with his absence, his ignorance, his cowardice. Clara stood, her small body trembling, her eyes filled with a grief too big for her to carry, and she turned to leave, her steps quick and unsteady as she headed for the door. "Clara, wait," Victor called after her, his voice desperate, his hands reaching out as if he could stop her, but she didn't turn back. The bell jingled as she pushed the door open, the cold air rushing in, and then she was gone, disappearing into the street, leaving Victor alone with the photograph, the drawing, and the unbearable truth that he had lost his daughter all over again. He sat there, his head in his hands, his tears soaking into the table, and for the first time in his life, Victor Langston, the billionaire who had everything, felt truly, utterly powerless. Victor Langston sat alone in the bakery long after Clara had left, the photograph of Eleanor and newborn Clara still clutched in his trembling hands, the drawing she had made for him, a dream of a father who never came, lying on the table before him. The warmth of the bakery, with its lingering scent of cinnamon and yeast, felt like a cruel mockery of the cold emptiness inside him, a void that had grown with every revelation, every tear Clara had shed. He had built an empire, amassed a fortune that could buy anything in the world, but in this moment, he realized that none of it mattered, not the penthouse, not the private jets, not the power that had defined his life for so long. All that mattered was the little girl who had walked out that door, the daughter he had failed, the daughter who might never forgive him. And for the first time in years, Victor felt the full weight of his own humanity, the raw, unfiltered pain of a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. The bakery was dark now, the afternoon light fading into a soft, gray dusk, and Victor sat in the shadows, his suit rumpled, his face streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. He traced the lines of Eleanor's face in the photograph, her green eyes staring back at him with a love he didn't deserve, a love he had thrown away in his pursuit of a life that now felt hollow. He remembered the way she had looked at him that night in the cafe, her hands trembling as she told him she was pregnant, her voice breaking as she begged him to choose them. And he remembered the way he had walked away, telling himself he'd come back, that he'd make things right, but he hadn't. He had chosen his ambition over his family, and now, 7 years later, he was paying the price, a price far steeper than he ever could have imagined. Clara's words echoed in his mind, a relentless refrain that he couldn't escape, "You should have known. You should have fought for her. You should have fought for me." She was right, and the truth of it was a knife in his heart, twisting with every breath he took. He had failed Eleanor, had failed Clara, had failed himself, and the realization brought with it a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices he had made, but he could change the future. He could fight for Clara now, could be the father she deserved, even if she never accepted him, even if she never forgave him. He owed her that much, owed Eleanor that much, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it, no matter how long it took. Victor stood, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He tucked the photograph and the drawing into his pocket, his hands steady now, a quiet resolve settling over him like a cloak. He left the bakery, the bell jingling softly behind him, and stepped into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. He drove to the small apartment building where Mrs. Harper had told him Clara lived, a modest place on the edge of the city, its brick facade worn but sturdy, a far cry from the glass towers of his world. He parked across the street, his eyes scanning the windows, searching for a sign of her, but the lights were off, the apartment empty. A neighbor, an older woman with a kind face, told him Clara and Mrs. Harper had left that afternoon, their bags packed in a hurry, their destination unknown. They didn't say where they were going, the woman said, her voice soft with sympathy as she saw the desperation in Victor's eyes. But the girl looked sad. Real sad. Victor's heart sank, a fresh wave of guilt washing over him as he realized Clara had run from him, had taken the only home she'd known and fled because of the pain he had caused. He thanked the woman, his voice hollow, and returned to his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he fought the urge to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But he didn't. Instead, he drove to the cemetery where Eleanor was buried, the place where this nightmare had begun, the place where Clara had first confronted him with the truth. The gates were locked, but Victor didn't care. He climbed over the fence, his suit tearing on the jagged metal, and made his way to Eleanor's grave, the moonlight casting long shadows across the headstones. He knelt before the grave, his hands pressing into the cold earth, his tears falling freely now as he spoke to the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking, his words carried away by the night wind. "I failed you. I failed our daughter. But I'm here now. I'm here, and I'll find her. I'll make this right, I swear it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph, and placed it on the grave, his fingers lingering on Eleanor's face for a moment before he stood, his resolve hardening with every breath. He didn't know where Clara had gone, didn't know if she'd ever come back, but he knew he couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop trying. He had spent 7 years running from his past, but now, he would spend the rest of his life chasing his future, a future that included his daughter, whether she wanted him or not. As he left the cemetery, the first stars appearing in the sky above, Victor felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing that warmed the edges of his broken heart. He thought of Clara's drawing, of the little girl who had dreamed of a father who would come for her, and he vowed to be that father, to be the man Eleanor had believed he could be. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, Clara," he said aloud, his voice steady now, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know if you'll ever want me in your life. But I'll find you. I'll keep looking, no matter how long it takes, because you're my daughter, and I love you. I've always loved you, even when I didn't know you were mine." And with that, Victor Langston, the billionaire who had once thought he had everything, set out to find the only thing that truly mattered, his heart heavy with regret but lifted by a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Months had passed since Victor Langston left the cemetery that night, his heart heavy with a vow he had made to Eleanor's memory, a promise to find their daughter and make things right. The city had moved on, its rhythm unchanged, but Victor was a different man, his once unshakable focus on wealth and power replaced by a quiet, relentless determination to find Clara. He had hired private investigators, scoured every lead, visited every small town and bakery where Mrs. Harper might have taken her, but the trail had gone cold, each dead end a fresh wound in his already battered heart. Yet he didn't give up. He couldn't. Clara was out there, somewhere, and he would find her, even if it took the rest of his life. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Victor found himself in a small park on the outskirts of a neighboring city, a place he had come to after hearing a rumor about a bakery that had recently opened, one that specialized in cinnamon rolls just like the ones Clara had made at the gala. The park was quiet, the leaves a riot of red and gold, the air filled with the laughter of children playing on a nearby swing set. Victor sat on a wooden bench, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the crowd with a weary hope that had become second nature. He had been to dozens of places like this, chasing whispers and shadows, but something about this park felt different, a pull he couldn't explain, a feeling that had grown stronger with every step he took. And then he saw her. Clara was sitting on a bench across the park, her small frame wrapped in a familiar threadbare coat, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon, a book open on her lap as she read to a group of younger children gathered around her. Mrs. Harper sat nearby, her hands busy with a knitting project, her face soft with a contentment that Victor hadn't seen before. Clara's voice carried on the breeze, her words gentle but animated as she brought the story to life, her green eyes sparkling with a joy that made Victor's chest ache. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the moment, might send her running again. He just watched, his heart pounding, his eyes drinking in every detail of his daughter, the way her hands moved as she turned the pages, the way her smile lit up her face, the way she seemed at peace in a way she hadn't been at the cemetery, at the bakery, at the gala. One of the children, a little boy with a mop of curly hair, broke away from the group, his small legs carrying him across the grass as he chased a butterfly, his laughter ringing out like a bell. He stumbled, his tiny body tumbling forward, and Victor instinctively stood, his hands outstretched as if he could catch him from across the park. The boy landed softly in the grass, unharmed, but his fall had brought him close to Victor's bench, and as he looked up, his wide brown eyes met Victor's, a curious smile spreading across his face. "Hi, mister," the boy said, his voice bright, and Victor smiled back, his heart softening at the innocence in the child's gaze. "Hi," he replied, his voice gentle, and then the boy pointed at him, his small finger trembling with excitement. "You look like Clara's picture," he said, his words a jolt that sent Victor's heart racing. Clara's head snapped up at the sound of her name, her eyes following the boy's pointing finger, and when she saw Victor, her breath caught, her hands freezing on the book. The children around her turned to look, their chatter fading into a curious silence, and Mrs. Harper set down her knitting, her expression a mix of surprise and caution as she watched Victor approach. He moved slowly, his hands at his sides, his eyes never leaving Clara's, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The boy ran back to Clara, tugging at her sleeve, his voice a loud whisper as he said, "Clara, it's the man from your drawing. The one you said was your daddy." Clara's cheeks flushed, her eyes darting to the ground, but she didn't deny it, didn't correct him, and that small silence gave Victor the courage to take another step forward. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, trembling with emotion, his hands shaking as he stopped a few feet away. She looked up at him then, her green eyes wide, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The children watched, their curiosity palpable, but Mrs. Harper stood, her presence a quiet reassurance as she nodded at Victor, a silent permission to continue. "I've been looking for you," Victor said, his voice breaking, his eyes brimming with tears as he took another step closer. "I've been looking for you every day since you left. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Clara. I know I failed you, failed your mother, failed myself. But I'm here now. I'm here, and I'll keep being here, every day, for as long as it takes. Because you're my daughter, and I love you. I've always loved you, even when I didn't know you were mine." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her small hands clutching the book to her chest, her body trembling as she looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the cemetery. She saw the lines on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the raw, unfiltered love that shone through his grief, and something inside her shifted, a wall she had built so carefully beginning to crumble. She didn't speak, didn't move, but the boy who had spoken earlier tugged at her sleeve again, his voice insistent. "Clara, he's your daddy, right? Like in the picture?" Clara's gaze flickered to the boy, then back to Victor, and slowly, so slowly, she nodded, her tears spilling over as she whispered, "Yes. He's my daddy." Victor's knees buckled, and he sank to the grass, his hands covering his face as a sob tore through him, the weight of her words a balm to the wounds he had carried for so long. Clara hesitated, her small body trembling, but then she set the book down, her steps tentative as she crossed the grass to where he knelt, her shadow falling over him like a blessing. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she touched his shoulder, her fingers light but steady, and Victor looked up, his eyes meeting hers, his tears mingling with hers as they fell. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice small but clear, her hand still on his shoulder. "But I don't want to hate you anymore. I don't want to be alone anymore." Victor reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reverent, as if he were afraid she might disappear, and he held it in his own, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, over the red bracelet that had brought them back together. "You'll never be alone again," he said, his voice steady now, his eyes locked on hers. "I promise you, Clara. I'll be here, every step of the way, for as long as you'll let me." Clara didn't pull away, didn't speak, but she nodded, her small hand tightening in his, and in that moment, under the golden autumn sky, Victor Langston and his daughter took the first step toward healing, toward a future where love could grow from the ashes of their past.